A physics PhD gets sentenced to, what, nearly 2 years in prison, and it's for retweeting a cartoon to a practically empty timeline.
Yeah, it's really quite something.
Right, and to defend himself against this charge of causing serious public disorder, he doesn't do the normal thing. He doesn't hire some powerhouse legal team. Instead, he sits in his jail cell and writes a 20,000-word mathematical proof. He literally uses the physical laws of quantum networking to dismantle the prosecution's case. So, welcome to the deep dive.
It is just an absolutely incredible story. I mean, we are looking at a huge stack of sources today. We've got official legal verdicts, deep psychological evaluations, scientific analyses, and, at the center of it all is that massive blood letter written by Dr. Jingyuan Chen.
Yeah, the letter is wild. So the mission for our deep dive today is to really explore what happens when the rigid binary machinery of a legal system collides head-on with the nonlinear realities of modern physics and deep psychology. But before we jump in, just a quick note to you, the listener. These sources contain some highly charged political content and viewpoints regarding Chinese governmental actions, leadership, and international relations.
Right, and we should be very clear here.
Exactly. We are not taking any sides or endorsing any of the political views presented. Our goal is simply to impartially report on the fascinating ideas and conflicts contained within the original source material.
Because the central conflict here is just profound. I mean, it reveals so much about how formal institutions function, or, well, completely fail to function when they're confronted with the vast complexity of the modern digital world.
Okay, let's unpack this and establish the premise. So we have Dr. Chen. He's a scholar. His academic focus is on complex nonlinear systems. And he's just at home, living a quiet life, when suddenly his house is raided by police.
Right, they seize everything. Phones, computers, hard drives.
Yeah, everything. And he's ultimately sentenced to 1 year and 8 months in prison for the crime of picking quarrels and provoking trouble. But, the method of this alleged crime. He just retweeted a handful of posts on an overseas platform, essentially Twitter, to an audience of fewer than 100 followers. And most of those were inactive accounts anyway.
He was basically a ghost on the platform. He rarely even added original commentary. The mechanism of his action was literally just hitting the retweet button on pieces of content that were already circulating out there in the wider internet ecosystem.
So you have this massive gaping chasm between the physical reality of a tiny retweet and the legal reality of a criminal courtroom. Let's look at the actual paperwork that put him in a cell to, try and understand the prosecution's logic. Because the sources show the prosecution claimed Dr. Chen knowingly spread false information and that this action caused a serious disorder of public order.
And the evidence they submitted to back up this claim, the proof of spreading dangerous false rumors. It basically included three primary things. First, a cartoon of a girl holding an umbrella, which was a symbol associated with the Hong Kong protests.
Okay.
Second, there was another political cartoon depicting Donald Trump and Xi Jinping. And finally, just a subjective personal comment he made about the manufacturing capabilities of Huawei chips.
Which, that makes my brain short circuit. Judging a political cartoon as true or false factual information, that is like trying to use a math rubric to grade a watercolor painting. It is a total category mistake.
It really is.
Right. Like a drawing of a girl with an umbrella operates on metaphor, on symbolism. It doesn't possess the scientific property of being falsifiable. You can't put a cartoon under a microscope, measure it, and declare it statistically inaccurate.
Exactly. And it goes deeper than just a simple mismatch of terms. The legal system took highly subjective human expressions, art, political opinions, emotional reactions, and forcefully shoved them into this strict binary framework of true factual information versus false factual information.
But wait, even if they, completely miscategorize the cartoons, the law usually requires proof of intent, right? Like to prove he knowingly spread false information, they must have found a journal entry or a direct message where he's admitting he's trying to start a riot or intentionally deceive people.
You would think so, but no. They didn't find any of that. They actually completely bypassed the need for empirical evidence of his intent by relying on a neurological quirk that they essentially systematized into law.
A neurological quirk? What do you mean?
So in cognitive psychology, there's this concept called the fundamental attribution error. Basically, when we observe someone else's behavior, our brains naturally default to blaming their internal character or intent, rather than, considering external circumstances.
Right, like if someone cuts me off in traffic, I assume they're a jerk, not that they're rushing to the hospital.
Exactly. That's the fundamental attribution error. And A court basically took this mental shortcut and codified it. The verdict explicitly stated that because Dr. Chen has a high educational background, the guy holds a PhD, he ought to be able to distinguish right from wrong.
Oh, wow.
Right. Therefore, the court reasoned he must have known these abstract posts were false, and he must have spread them with malice.
That is just, wow. They substituted actual evidence of intent with an assumption based purely on his identity. Like, you're smart, so you must have known better, therefore you are guilty. They traded a factual judgment of what he actually knew for a normative judgment of what they think he ought to know.
Yeah, institutions often rely on heuristics like this when they're backed into a corner by a lack of tangible evidence. It's a shortcut.
Which really begs the question, why would a formal legal system, which is theoretically designed to operate on rigorous mechanical evidence, rely on such bizarre, flawed leaps of logic? And the psychological profiles in our sources provide a really fascinating answer to this. They frame the legal system not just as a set of rules, but almost as a living organism suffering from a condition called institutional anxiety.
Right. If you view a bureaucracy or a rigid legal system as an organism, its primary survival mechanism is control. These systems have a remarkably low tolerance for ambiguity. They operate on an external locus of control. They need rigid rules, clear-cut categories, binary thinking to function, and action just has to be either right or wrong, true or false, harmless or dangerous.
And then you introduce the internet, which is vast, entirely uncertain, infinitely complex, and mostly just operates in a gray area.
Yeah, the internet is the organism's natural predator. When a rigid system faces this massive, non-linear uncertainty, it experiences a profound loss of control.
Yeah.
So, to regain its footing and soothe its institutional anxiety, the system has this intense psychological compulsion to find a scapegoat.
Right.
It needs to take something ambiguous, slap a definitive threat label on it, and neutralize it just to prove to itself that it still has power.
So because the system is terrified of the unmanageable chaos of the internet, it grabs a guy retweeting a cartoon to 50 people and crushes him just to feel like the gears are still turning. And what makes this so tragic is that Dr. Chen's personal psychology is the exact mirror opposite of the institution's. The evaluations in the sources describe him as possessing a rational, independent personality, which is driven by this concept called epistemic humility.
Yeah, epistemic humility is a philosophical stance. It's basically a profound comfort with acknowledging that you do not hold absolute truth. As a scientist, Dr. Chen's default state is doubt. He thrives in the gray area, exploring multiple perspectives, gathering disparate data points, which, completely explains why his timeline was a collage of different retweets.
But to a highly anxious, rigid institution, that open-minded skepticism is just completely illegible. The court literally cannot process it. The institution misreads his intellectual curiosity as disobedience and his comfort with uncertainty as deliberate, malicious chaos.
They are operating on entirely different operating systems.
I do have to challenge something here, though. Playing devil's advocate, Dr. Chen is locked in a cell. He is facing interrogations, extreme isolation, the complete collapse of his normal life. And his response is to write a 20,000-word, highly technical academic defense of his retweets. Is it possible he is just, entirely ignoring the reality of his grim situation?
Mm-hmm.
Is this extreme reliance on high-level physics just his ultimate survival mechanism? Like his only way to not lose his mind in prison?
Well, you might think it's just a delusion to survive, but look at the actual math he produced. Delusions aren't mathematically rigorous. What you're describing is a real psychological mechanism called intellectualization, combined with cognitive reappraisal.
Okay, break that down for me.
So, faced with a traumatic, uncontrollable environment where most people would just collapse into learned helplessness, Dr. Chen used his primary psychological asset, his intellect, to maintain his structural integrity. He cognitively reappraised his trauma, transforming his imprisonment from a personal tragedy into a complex academic puzzle to be solved.
Oh, I see. So he turned the courtroom into his laboratory.
He did. And the output of that coping mechanism is a brilliant, scientifically flawless defense. He didn't write a key for mercy begging the judge for forgiveness. He wrote a diagnostic report of the legal system using the foundational laws of physics.
Okay, this is the part of the sources I've really been waiting to get into, because the actual physics he uses to dismantle the legal charge of causing public disorder is just mind-blowing. He realizes the law won't save him, so he turns to the physical laws governing the internet, and he starts by invoking the CAP theorem.
Right, the CAP theorem. It's a bedrock mathematical principle in distributed computing and network design. CAP stands for consistency, availability, and partition tolerance. The theorem mathematically proves that in any distributed network, like a global social media platform, it is physically impossible to guarantee all three properties simultaneously.
Wait, okay, I know what a partition is on a hard drive, but how does that apply to a global timeline of retweets? Like, why can't a network have all three?
So imagine two massive data centers running a social network. One is in New York, the other is in Tokyo. A partition means the communication link between these two centers breaks down or delays. The network now faces a mathematically forced choice.
Okay.
It can choose consistency, meaning it shuts down access to users until the link is fixed, ensuring no one sees outdated or contradictory information. Or it can choose availability, meaning it lets users keep posting and reading, but accepts that the New York users and the Tokyo users will see different inconsistent versions of the timeline for a while.
And social media platforms whose entire business model relies on constant engagement are always going to choose availability. They never shut down.
Exactly. Therefore, by choosing availability and partition tolerance, social networks permanently sacrifice absolute consistency. Inconsistency or disorder is baked into the very code of the platform. So Dr. Chen argued that the court blaming his retweet for creating disorder in the network completely ignores the physics of the system. Blaming him for disorder is like blaming a single leaf for the wind. The leaf is just making the pre-existing turbulence visible. The chaos is a mathematical prerequisite of the platform existing at all.
That is such a profound defense. You are charging me with a crime for a condition that is mathematically inescapable. But he goes even further, right? To address the specific charge that his specific action of retweeting causes serious disorder. And to dismantle that, he brings in the concept of scale-free networks and Cohen's critical threshold formula.
Yes. To understand Cohen's formula, we first have to understand the topology, like the physical map of a scale-free network.
Let me take a swing at this one. So social media platforms are scale-free networks, meaning the connections aren't distributed evenly like a grid. You have a handful of massive hub nodes. These are the mega stars, the major news outlets, politicians with millions of followers. And then you have millions upon millions of peripheral nodes that only connect to, like, a few people.
That's spot on. Dr. Chen, with his inactive audience of less than 100, is the ultimate peripheral node. He exists on the extreme, microscopic long tail of this network topology.
And this is where Cohen's critical threshold formula comes in. What does that mathematical threshold actually measure?
The formula calculates the exact point at which a network's connectivity becomes self-sustaining, or, conversely, the point at which it breaks down. In a scale-free network, because the variance in the number of connections between the giant hubs and the tiny peripheral nodes approaches infinity, the critical threshold for breaking the network approaches zero.
Meaning the network is structurally immune to the tiny nodes.
Mathematically immune. You could randomly delete almost all of the peripheral nodes in a scale-free network or have them act completely randomly, and the macro structure of the network would not collapse. The information flow remains robust because the hubs do all the heavy lifting.
So Dr. Chen's defense is mathematically proving that the impact of his tiny account retweeting a cartoon approaches absolute zero on a systemic level. It is scientifically impossible for his action to trigger a systemic avalanche or a serious disorder. The legal claim literally breaks the fundamental laws of causality.
It's a complete rupture of cause and effect. The prosecution argued that his tweet caused the chaos. Dr. Chen points out that if the system were truly on the brink of total collapse from one tiny retweet, it means the entire network was already in a highly volatile, supercritical state.
A supercritical state. So like a mountainside loaded with unstable snow, where just a single whisper could trigger an avalanche.
Yes, exactly. If the snowpack is already that unstable, the whisper isn't the root cause of the avalanche, the instability of the mountain is. And the prosecution utterly failed to prove that the entire Chinese internet was in a supercritical state just waiting for his retweet to destroy it. They applied simple, linear 19th century mechanics like A hits B, so B moves to a non-linear 21st century complex system.
He's basically arguing that blaming his tiny account for collapsing the social order is like blaming a single breath of CO2 from one person for causing global warming. It is a complete misunderstanding of scale and physics.
And he proved it using peer-reviewed mathematics.
Which brings us to the profound tragedy of this whole deep dive. Dr. Chen's scientific defense is mathematically flawless. The network theory is indisputable. But he had to know that the judge in that courtroom wouldn't understand the CAP theorem. He had to know the prosecutor didn't care about the mathematical variance of hub nodes in Cohen's formula. The legal system was never going to engage with his science. So why? Why dedicate massive amounts of mental fortitude to writing a 20,000-word scientific treatise from a jail cell when you know the jury won't read it?
Because, as the analysis in our sources makes clear, this blood letter wasn't actually meant for the judge. Dr. Chen realized very early on that the institutional language of the court and the scientific language of physical reality had suffered a complete and utter fracture. They were entirely incapable of translating each other.
The legal organism only spoke in binary labels, right? Like rumor, malice, disorder, while Chen only spoke in probabilities, network topology, and empirical evidence.
Exactly. Knowing the court was fundamentally deaf to his reality, he bypassed the immediate legal proceedings entirely. He addressed the document to the future, to history.
To readers like you, the listener.
Yeah. This document is ultimately a diagnostic report on civilization. It's a flashing warning light about what happens when any powerful institution refuses to acknowledge the complexity, the nonlinearity, and the inherent uncertainty of the modern world.
Because when institutions demand simple binary answers to complex human realities, they end up criminalizing the pursuit of knowledge itself. They criminalize nuance.
Because to a system that demands absolute, unquestioning certainty just to soothe its institutional anxiety, the scientific method itself looks like a threat. The act of asking questions, considering alternative hypotheses, acknowledging doubt, all of that is perceived as picking quarrels.
So what does this all mean for you? I mean, think about how often we see this dynamic playing out in our own lives. We see institutions all the time, whether it's a corporate HR department relying on strict checkboxes and zero-tolerance policies, or digital moderation algorithms on social media platforms using rigid, binary labels to punish nuanced, complex human behavior.
We are increasingly governed by systems that cannot process context. They scan for keywords, they look for violations of a strict binary code, and they execute a penalty. They entirely lack the epistemic humility that Dr. Chen embodied. They are structurally incapable of pausing and saying, this situation is complex, let's tolerate the ambiguity to understand the truth.
It's a profound reminder that we have to actively protect our own epistemic humility in a world that constantly demands absolute certainty and snap judgments from us. We have to be willing to sit in the gray areas.
And we have to demand that the institutions that govern us upgrade their operating systems to actually comprehend the complex networks they're trying to regulate, rather than just smashing them with a hammer.
Let's wrap up this deep dive. We've gone on quite a journey today. We started with a legally flawed conviction over a few retweets of political cartoons. We dug into the psychology of how institutions systematize the fundamental attribution error to bypass evidence. We unpacked the psychological clash between a rigid, anxious legal organism and the hyper-resilient, intellectualizing mind of Dr. Chen. And we explored his brilliant use of the CRP theorem and Cohen's critical threshold to scientifically dismantle the charges against him by proving that chaos is just an inherent property of the internet.
It is a stark, beautifully articulated reminder of the massive gap between human complexity and institutional machinery.
And that leaves us with a final, lingering question for you to mull over. Dr. Chen highlighted the terrifying gap between a 20th century legal system and the complex network physics of current social media. But looking ahead, as we rapidly integrate incredibly complex, non-linear artificial intelligence systems into our society's systems that operate on vast neural networks and probabilistic logic rather than strict rules, how will these same rigid, linear institutions ever hope to govern or judge AI? If a court cannot understand the simple network physics of a retweet, what happens when that exact same legal machinery is forced to judge the intent of a generative algorithm?
Yeah, that is a collision that will make the physics of a retweet look like child's play.
The institutional gears are going to hit something infinitely more complex. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking questions, keep seeking out multiple perspectives, and whatever you do, never lose your epistemic humility. See you next time.